So schools like ours that use the IB curriculum, it's really, really helpful to our students because, they have standardized scores. There's a relatively standardized curriculum and approach. And so universities know what students are coming in with.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to IB Matters. And I'm speaking with Leah Thayer today. And what kind of an interesting connection here is through my daughter, who used to work with her and her previous work. But welcome, Leah, to the podcast.
Thank you, John. I'm really excited to be here with you.
And tell us a little bit about, what you've been doing. So you did work for the same NGO that my daughter worked for at one time. Do you want to fill folks in on a little bit of your background career-wise?
Yeah, so I've always been focused on the issue of access to different kinds of services. So early in my career, I was working with refugees and internally displaced people in conflict zones and looking at some of the issues around access to food support, other kinds of support in conflict settings.
Mm-hmm.
Then I moved into public health and did that for around 20 years, really looking at and working on programs that helped the most marginalized people in the world to access public health services. During that time, I had my own kids and watched them go through international school and watched both the advantages and the challenges that went along with that and got really interested in international education.
Mm-hmm.
And so started doing the additional training to shift into international education. What I'm working in now, I'm working with an international school, the International School of Phnom Penh in Cambodia.
Okay. So right now you are acting as a counselor at your school?
Yeah, I'm specifically focused on the university side of things. So I'm a college counselor and future pathways advisor. So helping students to access higher education, and in the case of our students, especially global higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And then parallel to that, I'm doing a lot of research and writing. I have a Substack where I write about issues of leadership and mobility and education, and then the academic work that I'm doing through my doctorate and also attempting to develop.
Yeah. So for the listeners, let's make sure that we put a link to your Substack in our podcast notes so they can follow that going forward. Is your Substack, what is the name of the Substack?
Pathway Partnerships and Perspectives. It's really covering sort of issues, ruminations, linking research and practice around leadership, mobility, and access in global education.
Is this for you based on some of your history and so on, and given your current context? Are you finding this work that you're doing kind of connected to the school you're in right now, or more your interest in the academic side or the practical side of making more education or higher education accessible to more?
I would say it's both. Through the work at my school, I'm really learning the ins and outs of helping students to access global higher education and, what it takes to give students an advantage, what doesn't work to students' advantage, what the challenges are, how to build these kinds of relationships and what matters in building relationships. So that very practical side is very much part of my job. And I mean, the students at my school are for the most part very privileged, but there are still challenges with being in a smaller quote unquote market, as universities know, a country like Cambodia. From that perspective, we still have to deal with a lot of the kinds of challenges that we're going to talk about today. I think parallel to that, my research and the work that I'm developing outside of school is looking at all of this from a broader perspective. And I think that these are issues, obviously, that have a much, much greater impact on students from schools, for example, that don't use standardized curriculum, that don't use curricula, that don't use, for example, the IB, or students who aren't in a capital city, or students who may not have sort of very consistent access to education as they're going through. So it's kind of both, but the practical really getting to understand this system and how it works and the mechanisms is very much through my current job. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to get to be part of.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're you're getting both that hands-on side and also using your research that you're working on just to kind of think, how do you put these together? And that's what I really want to hear about now. It's like you got me intrigued. So got a student that is, like you said, in a place that has maybe a regular education in terms of the consistency. They're maybe in a smaller area, more remote. But we all know that at least I think everyone listening believes in the ability, the inherent ability of young people, no matter where they're located, and the opportunities they had. How do you find a student or connect a student that has high aspirations and probably has some talent and some interest in doing more than their community would necessarily provide or give them access to? How do you connect them to opportunities like higher education and maybe even a better education for them at the age they're at?
So, one thing I'll just say is that a lot about the global education admissions process is about universities knowing a school. I think that plays actually an outsized role in the process, especially for more elite universities, just because then universities are going to know the quality of education that a student is coming in with, their university readiness, that kind of thing. So if schools are in smaller and less visible markets, that can make it quite difficult.
Hmm.
It's just as universities' budgets are cut, it's harder for their admissions people to get out to this wider range of markets. And it's hard for them to connect with schools that don't have an obvious point person who they know and who they have a relationship with.
Right.
So that's the first thing to say. I think another thing that's challenging is if schools don't use a standardized curriculum. So schools like ours that use the IB curriculum, it's really, really helpful to our students because they have standardized scores. There's a relatively standardized curriculum and approach. And so
Right.
universities know what students are coming in with. So I think it's sort of almost separate processes. If it's students coming from a school like ours, a lot of it is about giving them the visibility. For me, as the point person with universities, figuring out how to connect with the universities, how to build relationships with them, how to best give our students visibility to them, and also how to best give the universities and the processes from particular countries visibility to our students and how to make them as clear as possible, which really helps students in the process of knowing how to position earlier in secondary school and then how to apply later in secondary school. Having a point person is very helpful. And not every school has a college counselor and
Right.
not every school has someone with dedicated time for that. But I do think when there can be a single point person, it can be really helpful just because then universities know who to connect with.
Hmm.
Um, there are a large number of online tools for developing knowledge in this area. And so, if somebody even has a little bit of time, if a teacher, for example, has a little bit of time to help facilitate that issue, there are tools out there for them to build the expertise. One of the things that I see a lot of universities doing is trying to find different ways to work with and partner with secondary schools and a wider range of secondary schools. And again, I want to emphasize that I do think that this issue of the standardized curriculum, that's in a sense what separates schools as far as how easy it is for the students to access global higher education systems. But one of the things that I do see happening is that a lot of universities who have made the decision that they're going to work on accessing these smaller markets, they'll have representatives spend a lot of time in country. They'll link both directly with schools and offer things like master classes, for example, which can
Yeah.
also be available to faculty, or often some offer seminars on applying to the higher education system from that country in particular. So, for example, someone might come from a UK university and not just talk about their university, but also talk more broadly about applying to university in the UK. And they'll make those kinds of skills building sessions available not just to the students, but also to the faculty. The other thing that I'm seeing is that there are certain kinds of independent institutions and agencies that are playing a really important role in terms of reaching out to these schools and helping to facilitate the linkage between universities and schools that may not otherwise get contacted or
Yeah.
otherwise have access to these contacts. And I think that's just incredibly important too, because the reality is that schools, especially with limited resources, just aren't going to have the people who can be
Right.
spending a lot of
Right.
time and energy on these relationships and on this access issue.
Yeah. Well, the position of college counselor, and here in the United States where I'm located, most of our big public high schools have a counselor who specializes in the college application process. Their offices are typically a room that holds 25 to 30 people, and it's surrounded by pennants from all the colleges. But, prior to that, and in smaller schools, like you said, they don't always have a college counselor. Every teacher in some respect is a mentor, or they should be. And I think one of the questions I had for you, if you are that kind of person, if you're listening or someone, what are some of the things that a unofficial counselor, a mentor, a teacher, it could be their science teacher, it could be their art teacher, that says this kid deserves a chance to go somewhere different or special or move beyond the local community? What are some things they can do? Where can they find some resources to help those students?
So I think a big part of it is helping students with sort of clarity around the process and clarity around the requirements. I think it can just be incredibly challenging if you're a student or a parent,
Yeah,
sort of looking at many universities' websites, for example, trying to interpret what they mean, or if you know that particular countries may have particular course requirements or that kind of thing, knowing how to understand that
yeah,
um, is really challenging. And so I think one thing that teachers and other people who sort of care and who want to help their students and their parent population, helping in that interpretation process. And again, I don't mean just linguistic interpretation, but also sort of the interpretation of the bigger picture, the interpretation of when they say extracurricular activities, for
mm,
example, what does that mean? And not only what does that mean in terms of the types of activities, but also what does that mean in terms of how to present the impact or the results? So, some of those kinds of interpretation issues, just sitting with families and helping them to understand what the information online is saying. The good thing is at this point, almost everything that anyone will need to know is available somewhere
yeah,
online, but it's easily interpretable. I think another thing that if a teacher is really interested in helping students and there isn't somebody already doing this at the school, helping to give some visibility to the school. Again, given that the data suggests that a huge amount about university admissions is around admissions folks from a university knowing the school. It's not just the students, it's the school.
yeah,
That if a teacher can help with giving some visibility to the school and sort of looking at how the school presents itself through, for example, an academic profile that explains the curriculum and the grading system and what students are coming out with, or, so giving some visibility to the school in terms of maybe helping with online presence and helping with sort of stories about what the school is
yeah,
offering its students. I think all of those things can make a difference. It's not really black and white. It's not that it will necessarily automatically help students get into schools, but I think it's that gray area that helps universities recognize the quality and the value of what the school is doing and what that means in terms of the strength of the students coming
yeah,
out of the school. They're small things, but they're big things. The pieces around the application process. I mean, if students don't have somebody who can review their applications, read their essays, provide feedback, those are things that teachers are so good at doing anyway. And
hmm,
so, if they can do that for the application process, I mean, the difference between a student's first draft and a late draft in an application essay, I just find that things sort of strengthen by leaps and bounds just with targeted feedback. And that's something that not every student has access to. So that's
hmm,
something that whether or not someone is a dedicated college counselor as a teacher, that's something they can do to really support their students.
yeah.
Students are so incredibly nervous about their futures, kind of
Oh, yeah,
always. They
yeah,
approach sort of later secondary school. And for example, if they're doing the IB diploma and they're approaching exams, I mean, they're just so scared that things aren't going to work out. And they're so scared that they're not going to have opportunities. I mean, so often students will come in and say, what if I don't get in anywhere?
yeah,
And, so using that steadiness to help them to feel calm about their futures and to approach their processes of building their futures
hmm,
more calmly. I mean, everyone does better when they're working calmly rather than working frantically.
Right. I worked as a diploma program coordinator, and so I ended up in that role quite often with kids. And it is tough. You just realize when you're in it. And then it's also true for parents. I mean, there's a big difference between the parent with their oldest child and the third or fourth child. They just, they want to get it perfect. They haven't been through it before. And of course, for every individual student, unless they have a close sibling that they really follow along, but for themselves, each one is dealing with their own individual reality, and they kind of know what they often know what they don't know, and so they're a little scared, or they know what they haven't done, haven't quite studied that, didn't read the whole book or whatever.
Exactly. Or they
Yeah.
imagine what they don't know to be bigger than what they actually don't know.
Thanks, Leah. Is there anything else that we should share with folks about some of the things that you're working on, or maybe any future Substack articles you have in the works that we could hear about?
So my next Substack article is going to focus on the issue of access to global higher education for people from these less visible countries, and sort of focusing on the things that schools can do, but also the things that universities can do. One of the questions that you'd asked me when we communicated before this, which I thought was really interesting, and I spent some time thinking about, was this
Yeah.
issue of how listeners can help and
Yes.
contribute. And that's an interesting one because it's not obvious, but there are important things that people can do. We talked about the issue of sort of clarity and sort of creating clarity in the process. I think a lot of people are alumni for particular institutions and offering to support their alma maters in supporting students. So, for
Yeah.
example, from the University of wherever, and that university is interested in supporting students that may not have the support from within their school. Some of the kinds of things that alumni can do that can really help students are, for example, one-to-one mentorship through the application process, or reading and reviewing essays, or talking through strategies, that kind of thing. And that's something that I think most people can do by virtue of whether it's being an alumnus of a high school or being an alumnus of a university. A lot of people have audiences that they have access to.
Yeah.
This is obviously a bit of a more difficult thing, but if they're able to give visibility to either students from or schools from these smaller places, and again, I totally recognize that that's easier said than done because you need to have relationships with people from these less visible markets.
Right.
But I mean, for example, what you're doing, inviting me onto this podcast, it's wonderful because it gives a sense of the fact that there are these countries out there that maybe students aren't applying to university from as much, or applying to a particular university from as much, but these students are bringing great things to the table. So sort of enabling and amplifying that conversation about students from places that aren't sort of the big countries that
Mhm.
are feeding students into the global higher education system. I think another thing is just helping to debunk the myth that it's only those few elite universities that matter.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are so many great schools out there, and so many of them have really wonderful ways of working with students. Great universities, I should say, have so many great ways of working with students. I increasingly see like universities that are focusing on workplace readiness, and it's not always the top universities, but they're just doing great things in terms of facilitating internships as part of study, or giving students professional skills. And I mean, those kinds of things are really great. One other thing that I'll say is for students with no financial means, this is something that's a huge challenge. We do have a scholarship program at the school, and one of the things that's really challenging is if a student gets a full tuition scholarship, that may not be enough to allow them to attend
Right.
a university. There are so many other costs going along with that, with living costs and
Transportation.
transportation and that kind of thing. So, finding ways to connect with and contribute to organizations that help with that, because that for me is just about the saddest thing
Yeah.
imaginable. And then there are just a lot of innovations that are out there. There are these like reverse admissions platforms, which are platforms which are trying to use electronic means to get students in more remote areas in front of university representatives. So supporting some of those kinds of initiatives, sort of looking for those initiatives that are really focused on this access piece, and supporting them either, to a certain extent with money, but also with time and energy can be really
Mhm.
helpful.
So then what about the institution? You mentioned a couple times that having a structured curriculum like the IB is helpful. Is there something that the IB could be doing that would make these opportunities easier? Some schools like your school is a well-established IB World School. Is there anything that IB could be doing to make it a little less formal for kids to be connected to the IB? Do you think, should they open up IB courses to kids who aren't in an IB school, for example?
The thing that I've seen that makes the greatest difference, and I was thinking about this from the perspective of schools that are already IB schools, although that's a really interesting question about what they could do for reaching out to non-IB schools. I'd need to think about that a little bit more. But
Sure.
for IB schools, one of the things that it seems like there's a lot of attention on, and which is wonderful, is sort of the efforts at strengthening recognition of particular IB courses or of the IB curriculum as a whole. It's sort of, I know there's a lot of work going on around negotiating recognition.
Mhm.
And that's not only for admissions, but also for college credit. So many students, even the wealthiest students, I think, struggle with paying for higher education at this point. So if there can be recognition and credit given for IB courses that have been taken, say at the diploma level, that does make a difference for a lot of students in terms of whether they're, paying for 3.5 years versus 4 years, or 2.5 versus 3, or
Right,
whatever. I
right.
think that from a cost wise, that makes a big difference. But again, to just making sure that different countries that are working to globalize their higher education systems are recognizing and are taking into account IB qualifications. That's very helpful in terms of opening the number of countries that students from schools like ours can consider studying in. I mean, standardization is such a big issue, and that's one thing that I sort of intuited as a parent before I got into this, but now I'm really experiencing as an educator, is just how much of an advantage it is to have standardized qualifications. And
Yeah,
if there were different ways of making that happen through coursework as opposed to a full program, I just can't imagine that wouldn't help
yeah,
students.
yeah. The concept of recognition that you're talking about, it, we think of that as a more of a U.S. problem with public high schools. And the parents, some folks and some students are looking at a transactional view of taking IB, and that it's hard work, but it'll pay off because the school will give you credit. College will give you credit. And we always are trying to tell them, no, well, yeah, yes, you might get credit, but the better outcome is that you really had a great learning experience that will stay with you, whether or not you get credit. But we still have that issue. And in that vein, just to let you know that I am starting a project to create an audio course description for all the IB classes, the diploma classes. So
Wow.
I'm doing every course that I can get my hands on an interviewee, a teacher who teaches it, so that by group you'll be able to go and each one will, like for example, group one, I've got literature and then language and literature. I've got Lang and Lit scheduled for Wednesday. I'm interviewing a teacher, and then so that'll become group one, and then chapter one, chapter two, or whatever within it. And then the idea is that you'll be able to cut and slice that. So if you have your own school and you want kids to know, or if you want
Gosh.
teachers to know, or if you want a college to know, what is it you teach? What's in that thing? And the whole idea is to give voice to those subject briefs. The subject briefs that kind of describe the course, the two-pager that the IB puts
Yeah.
out. And so I'm making them short. I'm trying to keep them between 10 and 15 minutes. And I did a business one that's published right now. And then I've got tomorrow I'm interviewing a guy in all things sports, exercise, and health sciences. But then on Wednesday, I'm doing Lang and Lit. On Thursday, I'm interviewing a woman on visual arts. And just kind of keep plugging away until I get a substantial amount, and then I'll put them out as groups by group one, group two, and so on. And my thinking is that it'll actually help for however you want to explain to parents, you want to explain to kids. If you're thinking about doing the IB, and should I take this course or that course, and you can actually hear a teacher talk about the course. And I have a set of standard questions that kind of goes through the syllabus, but it also one of my favorite questions I ask is why do you like teaching this course? And the guy that did the business one, it was really fun to hear him talk about how he, really enjoys teaching business because of the way in which kids react to it and are engaged with the subject area. And he talked, I said, well, what a college is going to get out of a kid who's done this, and it's the critical thinking and the idea that they have some real world knowledge of how businesses work. And, they can look at an account sheet and say, here's how this works. So it was really interesting. It's the first couple of sound, they're kind of what I hoped they would be. So hopefully that'll continue, but I'll be putting that out, hopefully in the next couple months, have it done. So
that's such an amazing resource too, because if a school organizes like an IB fair or other kinds of things to help students in their course selection, that's great, but not every school has the ability to do that. And so having these kinds of online resources can really help students.
Yeah, I only brought it up because I heard you talking about colleges knowing what the course was and giving credit for it. That was one of the goals, is to give them they can hear a teacher talk about it, not just read it in the book, and say what it is.
Yeah, that's going to be such a helpful resource. I've been thinking about this idea of video actually, and sort of having video interviews with alumni or with teachers or with.
And that would be a good complement to it. We've got some schools that have done a nice job with alumni, and they put out YouTube videos about that. But frankly, that, for me, that's a little hard to access those kids. My goal is, once I get these out, is to actually add student voices to it as well. In other words, you've heard the teacher, how did it go? Or what did you do? What was your research project, or that kind of thing. But that'll be kind of a secondary level once I get these in place. So is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? I just really appreciate your spending all this time with me, and hearing about your research and about the work you're doing, and both prior to being an IB educator and now that you are one.
No, thanks so much. I mean, these are such fun issues to think about. And for me, thinking about how these different things fit together, how refugees and internally displaced people accessing food aid, and people in sort of the poorest, most marginalized groups accessing public health services, and students, especially from locations that are sort of less visible or more remote from universities they want to go to, accessing higher education. Like, these access issues, I think, are such interesting things to think about and talk about, and really important to work on. So thanks so much for inviting me to talk about all of this.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Please check out the podcast notes for links related to this episode. We now have over 135 IB Matters episodes covering a wide range of subjects. To help you find topics of interest to you, use our podcast webpage linked in the notes. There's also a link in the notes to directly text us with comments, suggestions, or to let me know that you would like to appear on a future episode of IB Matters. If you're an IBEN member who teaches a DP course or part of the DP or CP Core, and want to be part of my project to record a brief summary of the course you teach, please contact me. It'll only take 15 to 20 minutes of your time to record the summary, and I'll give you notes in advance so you know what we'll be covering. Find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcast, and hit subscribe so you don't miss any future programs. Please note that we are migrating our social network presence away from X. Find us on Instagram at IB_matters. Also, help spread the word about IB by liking, sharing, and reviewing the IB Matters links in your own feeds and social networks. Now in our 7th year, we've been heard in over 180 countries, a testament to the global reach of the IB.